Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teaching with Magic, a podcast exploring the intersection of education, fantasy, and literacy. Here at Teaching with Magic, we explore the different ways that teachers in the fiction and in the real world make magic for their students. You'll hear discussions about teachers and teaching methods in fantasy, science fiction, and pop culture. You'll hear interviews with scholars in various fields about important topics in education, and you'll get to be a part of an ongoing conversation about why the imagination matters. Welcome to Teaching with Magic. Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Magic, where we explore the many ways that teachers in the fiction world and the real world make magic for their students. Today's magical guest is Jordan Rannells, the technical editor for the Prancing Pony Podcast and the brains behind Lord of the Rings Soundscape. Jordan's wizardry with soundscapes provide an immersive audio experience to listen to alongside the Lord of the Rings books. He's also produced a podcast called The Music of Middle-earth, in which he analyzed Howard Shore's score to the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films. And as for his teaching, Jordan is a professor of music industry arts at Algonquin College in Ontario. He also teaches guitar, piano, and drums. I first had the pleasure of chatting with Jordan in 2020 after the Prancing Pony Podcast Moot. He and the friends of Mr. Underhill Smial of the Tolkien Society down in Houston had produced a beautiful soundscape audio project of the chapter The Council of Elrond. And I wanted to learn more about soundscape projects and how to bring that creative energy into the classroom. You can see a video clip of an interview with Jordan and Chad Bornholt from the Friends of Mr. Underhill Smial on my website under the post, The Magic of Multimedia. In today's conversation, Jordan and I chat about the details that go into a soundscape project, guiding students to thinking critically outside the box, and the ways that music, technology, and literature can intersect. So Jordan Rannells, editor of the PPP, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Very welcome. And may I say, is as behind the scenes, the scene behind the scenes. Edit. Sorry, Jordy. See, it only took 5 seconds. Edit. PPP would not exist without you. It would not. For obvious reasons.
It would be significantly longer.
It would be significantly longer, wouldn't it? Oh my goodness. I know that editing for the PPP is not your day job. What is your day job? What do you do?
Well, my day job switches a lot. This past year, I've been lucky enough for the soundscape that I'm working on to be pretty much my full-time job. But I do teach at the college here as well. I teach recording and various other aspects of the music industry. Kind of swaps around sometimes. So, but mainly recording, and then I teach privately as well. So a combination, but most things musical.
So you teach music through the technical aspect. Do you teach actual musical instruments as well? Hey.
Yeah. I teach guitar and bass. I have a few kind of songwriter students. I have taught some saxophone in the past, things like that. But right now it's mostly guitar and bass and songwriting. Yeah.
My goodness. I haven't touched a saxophone since the 5th grade.
Saxophone was my first instrument. That was what
it's actually quite fun.
It is. It's not as screechy as a clarinet when you first start, so it's a little bit easier.
I don't know. When I was in 5th grade, I was kind of screechy at times, but thankfully,
I'm sure I would not want to listen to our first practice session altogether.
It's probably better than my first try at a violin in the 4th grade. So
fun times.
So though you teach in a technical sense, and you teach music, what fantasy pop culture do you use in your teaching, if at all?
Well, it's kind of interesting because when I'm teaching recording, we're in the recording studio a lot of the time, and because I know the background of a lot of the other profs that are teaching, they teach musical context most of the time, which is awesome and cool. Jazz and rock and pop and R&B and everything like that. But I try as much as I can to be like, if we were doing movies, we could do this. Or if we were doing a score, we could do this. And talk about using the stuff that they're learning in a film or in just non-musical way. Because when you start jumping into, sound design like for Star Wars or something like that, the possibilities and the experimentation that you can do is way, way bigger. And so I think it's important to be like, learning how to mic up a drum kit is really cool. Learning how to do this with a guitar or that or whatnot with a piano, things like that. But to then take that and be like, how could we use this not in a musical scenario? And looking to fantasy and sci-fi and stuff like that for sound design stuff is the most obvious go-to. It's where you get to have the most fun for sure.
I would imagine that includes soundscapes, not just for a musical score, but also for even just the day-to-day, everyday happenings within a scene.
Exactly. Yeah. So a good example is like you might learn how to record a piano properly. And then if you look at a really obscure example maybe is in Attack of the Clones, the second Star Wars movie, there's the seismic charge that goes off. And the sound designer has not openly said what the main part of that sound is, but I would bet anything that it's a piano string being kind of slingshotted from within the grand piano. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff done to it, but I think that's what I mean. Like we kind of learn the proper way to do it for music, and then you can be like, okay, now what kind of wacky way can we record this to make sound design for a scene or for layers of a soundscape.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're teaching your students to think outside the box. Like it's one thing to teach them how to use the tool the way it's directed to be used, the way the instruction manual would tell you, but it's another to think, how could I take this even further and adapt?
Yeah. My big thing with teaching is always, and if it's teaching music, like an instrument, or if it's teaching recording, it's always like if you had a piano book to teach you piano, you shouldn't, I would say, need a teacher because that's what the book does.
Yeah.
But the teacher shows you everything other than that, kind of different ways of doing things or scenario-based things. So a lot of the time when I'm teaching recording, these are the mechanics of how to do the thing. And now it's up to you to figure out what you want to do with it. And I'm trying to get that point across where, yes, we can, this is the way that we set up a drum kit to be recorded, but what if you didn't do that? Like, how to record with a microphone, you know how to make it sound good, you know how to position it. We know how to route things. That's a lot of the work, is figuring out how to get from point A to point B. But with that information, what can you do with it? Instead of just following the pattern like everything else. And I focus a lot on what does it sound like, and is that actually what you're going for, and putting the thought into those steps instead of like, this is a drum kit and this is how we always record drums because that's how I was taught to record drums and I think it sounds good, but mostly it just looks good because that's what I was told and it looks the same as I was told, so we're good. Instead of like, what do I want it to sound like, and did I go through the steps to make it sound like that? Right. So really just trying to be proactive with our thinking and do things on purpose, I guess, is the end goal of that. I have a lot of students that I guess the way to put it is they might get a little bit frustrated with how I am teaching them, because a lot of it is what some people might call coyote teaching. So, answering their questions with questions. And
okay. Listeners, just so you know, if you can't see him right now, Jordan is currently wearing a Team Dwarf sweatshirt. However, the answer you just gave, very elf. You answer your students with yes and no.
Exactly. It's a lot of fun for me.
I'll bet it is.
Eventually, it should be fun for them. But yeah, it's cool, and especially in the class that I teach a lot, which is recording. It's like we have a team of maybe 10, 15 students, and in the early weeks, we learn how to do these things properly.
Mhm.
And so it might be second semester, and they might be like, okay, we got to record drums, and someone might come to me and be like, how do you want to set up the mics? And I say, how do you want to set up the mics? It's up to you now. You gotta, and the whole point is that all of these people have to be very independent when they graduate, because no one's going to tell them, and they have to decide for themselves. So
Yes.
early on, they have to make these decisions and decide what their goal is, or at least think through what their goal is, and not just go in and be like, okay, I'm just going to do what I was told because that's the safe route. And then their music recordings or their, film recordings or whatever it is ends up sounding the same as anything else. So got to get creative with it.
Exactly. So you mentioned Star Wars. Are there any other stories or pop culture references that you use in your teaching that really resonate with your students?
Let's see. In terms of sound design, Star Wars is definitely the go-to. But these days, actually using the new Dune movies are really good.
Ooh.
Because the sound designer, Mark Mangini, for the Dune movies, I listened to an interview with him talking about Dune, and a lot of it was he kind of listed out all of the tropes of sound design before making that movie and was like, these are all the things that we're not going to do. And and it's interesting because a lot of it is the opposite of Star Wars, because Star Wars set up the tropes.
Yeah.
And so, like, what's a good example? What does a force field sound like, right? Or what does a ship door opening sound like? All of that is whatever Star Wars said it was, right? And so he purposefully designed a lot of these things in Dune to not sound like that, to be like, let's pretend that there was no Star Wars, there was no what a force field sounds like, so let's make it from scratch and see what we get. And so it led to some really interesting and unique sounds in that movie. So I used that. Like I said, Star Wars or sci-fi stuff like that is the most out of the box kind of thing that you can be. But talking about Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit movies are good as well, because that was more of a, how do we get things that sound natural through natural means instead of digital means, recording the Balrog in a cave with cinder blocks and stuff like that, versus doing it digitally. But now it's interesting, because as you move into some of the tech that I'm showing them now that didn't exist when those movies were being made, I can kind of do both. I can use real sounds through digital means instead of going out and recording them again.
Okay.
I can do it in my computer using real recordings of things. So the tools have changed a little bit since the Lord of the Rings, especially. But there's interesting lessons to be learned there. And probably a topic that we'll get into later a little bit more is just the discussion of when to do what.
Yeah.
When to have music, when to have sound design, when to have neither, when to have just ambience. And those Lord of the Rings movies are perfect for that, although they are really score heavy.
Yeah.
There's score, like when you go and see it in the theater again, you notice how much there's music like every second of that movie almost. But then you go to, scenes in Dune that are just the sound of the sand, and how powerful that change can be. But yeah, I think that going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's interesting to talk about things that it's not fantasy, and how you could kind of say that those are like the rules. This is what a door sounds like. This is what um, a band sounds like on the other side of a window, right? Like, this is how we have to treat it so that it sounds like it should. And all the kind of rules to make things sound like they belong in this created movie. And then sci-fi and fantasy is like, okay, let's break all the rules to make it interesting, because what does a force field sound like? Whatever you want it to. So
Exactly.
It's really kind of cool to do that. And there's little moments that you can take from all of the big franchises, I guess you could say. And it's interesting to watch how these things evolve, like how in WandaVision, they can decide on a certain sound for Wanda's powers. And then in the future movies, those sound designers have to use that signature sound that's been designed already.
Right.
And it has to continue on so that it has continuity to it. So it's interesting. It's interesting. There's a lot of layers to it. But that's what's exciting. And I think that fantasy and sci-fi show you the possibilities of things. Whereas if you're, just doing like a cop show or something like that, it's just, like I said, the rules, and you have to follow the rules so that it fits. But yeah, then you mean I can't?
Yeah, you mean I can't give the local cop a photon torpedo?
Unfortunately, you could. That'd be fun, and then it quickly becomes something different.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. See the littlest details.
Exactly.
So, what are some of the results that you see in your students when you use these films and these scores? Like, what are some of the connections that you think your students have made with the subject material and these fantasy texts?
Well, I think that, I don't want to speak too broadly here, but a lot of especially when I'm teaching the sound design class, like if we're not talking about music at all, if we're just talking about sound design, it usually starts off with, let's record some footsteps, let's record some, cutlery moving, things like that, just normal kind of prop Foley type stuff. So just movement sounds. And that's always interesting because it's not music and they're doing something new now. And it's cool because we're using all the things that we learned in a new way. But the moment that it starts to become something that they kind of connect to and are interested in exploring is when we start talking about some of their movies and their favorite shows and things that, how did they make that sound? How did they do this? How did they do that? And it takes that step outside of the normal to be like, oh, this could be cool. I could do some cool things with this. And there's always students that are like, yeah, I've loved Lord of the Rings and I've always wondered how they did this, or, oh, I've seen the videos of how they made the lightsaber sounds in Star Wars or whatever. That's so cool. Now I can try it. Like, things like that always happen. And I think that fantasy stories or sci-fi stories or anything that's not real world, you could say, can hit harder because it's not real, because it's something outside of our experience. And so I think that taking from those things and bringing it into our recording gives it a solid anchor for interest and creativity, right? So you can watch your favorite Marvel movie and be like, oh, I wonder how they did that. And then because you love the content so much, you can dive in further and get excited. And one of the projects that they always do is they kind of redo the sound design for a scene in WALL-E and make all of his little motor sounds and all those kind of things. And it's because it's not footsteps and doors opening and stuff that it becomes interesting and it becomes cool, and they get to tell a little story with it, right? Because if you watch Wall-E, a lot of his sounds are mechanical and whatnot, and then you listen to the other robot and hers are totally different. But
Eva.
with this scene, they get to decide. Maybe Wall-E doesn't sound like that. Maybe he sounds like, rubber squeaks and stuff like that. That's all in their imagination to explore and play with. So yeah, hopefully that answers a little bit of that question.
Oh, that's great. So if I were a student, I were working on this scene, I would still have to, I imagine, match the sounds with what is happening on the screen. So it's not just a random rubber tire. It has to match up with the movement that Wall-E is actually making in the scene.
Yeah, the movement and the sounds have to line up. But the beauty of it being animation is that his treads can sound like whatever you want.
Yeah.
And if they're in time, then you believe it a little bit more, right? So doing like if fantasy and sci-fi were outside of the box, doing animation is like even further outside of the box because it's whatever you want. And there's there's tropes like I was talking about that don't even make sense, that we always look for in anime or for animation stuff, and things that you don't notice don't make sense because Pixar decided a long time ago that certain things should have movement to give them character, right? But it's not always anchored in reality. But I think that that's where the creativity stuff starts, right?
So the creativity almost becomes the rule. And then further down the line, you have to break that rule and get the creativity again.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's an interesting mind kind of exploration to be given a blank slate. And because especially when you think of Lord of the Rings, like almost none of that movie, none of what you hear was what was there on the day, right? Even the dialogue is re-recorded.
You're kidding.
So 99.9% of the dialogue was re-recorded, yeah. In ADR, that's what they call it. So none of it was real. So you're given a blank slate, basically, and you get to decide, what does the Momokill sound like? How heavy are its footfalls? All of that stuff is made up because there's no actual Oliphant there. But then you have to balance that with, what does the stuff that is real sound like? You get the classic trope that everyone talks about where swords are unsheathed, and that doesn't happen. But if you don't do it, then I don't know, it sounds a little weird. So there's a lot of little things like that where it's like, this is what's real, this is what people expect, and then there's the fantasy elements that don't exist and have no expectation, right? So it's like all over the place, but it's interesting because you have intuition. Like everyone has an intuition to what the Watcher in the Water should probably sound like, right? And so then it's a question of, how do I attain that sound or something that passes as that sound, and bring it to life in a way that feels right? And that's the kind of guiding principle of all of it. Does it feel right? And you can stray close or far from reality, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's a cool line to play with for sure.
Yeah. And I'll bet you play with that line a lot in your Soundscape.
I do.
Segue. Oh, I'm good. So how did your Soundscape get started? This is the long expected Soundscape, my friends. This is beautiful project by Jordan Rannells. And For those of you who have not yet heard of the Soundscape, this is a wonderful project that Jordan's been working on for the past year or so.
Yep.
And you had a fantastic Tolkien reading day. You and Articraft spent the whole day, with readings from the Fellowship of the Ring with your Soundscape and with Articraft's beautiful Minecraft work displayed on the screen.
Definitely.
So what got you started in the long expected Soundscape, and how did that grow? Like, how did this project come to be?
Well, the irony of it is it's titled A Long Expected Soundscape. And I had an idea to do the Kickstarter for it about a month and a half before it launched. So that planning part of it is not long expected, but the concept of it definitely was. And kind of story of my life is to have an idea stewing around for a long time, and then kind of, for whatever reason, finding the clarity of how to get it out, and then being like, okay, I'm going to do it. And then that final decision point happens really fast. So back when I had graduated from the same course that I teach now, back in 2013, I was working with a man that wanted to do just audiobook, kind of like a show reel. Like, this is what I could do, so he could get hired for things. And he did a reading from Sherlock Holmes. And I recommended, wouldn't it be cool if we put some sound effects and stuff in there? That'd be kind of cool. I can't really remember what spawned my idea for that, but I always liked, one of my goals from early on was to do sound design or scoring, or both, for movies. And because I watched the Lord of the Rings making of and all the Star Wars making of, and I was like, wow, that looks so cool. I want to do that, but I can't work on a movie, so this is like the closest thing that I can get to doing that. And so he recorded The Engineer's Thumb, which is just a short story from Sherlock, and I added a whole bunch of sounds to it and some music and whatnot, and I thought it was pretty cool. It was probably pretty bad. I don't know. That was a long time ago.
But the concept is really cool.
From that idea, it kind of, some years went by, and I kept thinking about how I could do that kind of thing. And then I got involved with the Prancing Pony podcast, and the Tolkien kind of world opened up more and more. And then I started my Music of Middle-earth podcast, exploring Howard Shore's themes. But on that podcast, I started doing these mini soundscape episodes where I would have, when the Fellowship has the battle with the wolves, and when we meet Ulmo and stuff like that. And I was just for fun trying to do those things again, because I wanted to do film stuff, and a big part of it was because I had heard Phil Dragish's unofficial audiobook of The Lord of the Rings, and I was like, wow, that's so cool, like what you can do. But the thing that was kind of different for me was that I went to school and I saw all the tech, and I was like, wow, it could be so much more than that. Phil did it all himself with limited resources, and I thought it was awesome, and he's an incredible voice actor, but there was so much more that could have been done. And so for a while I started thinking about that, and there's a series called The Dresden Files, which is like grown-up Harry Potter, you could say. And
boy, could ya.
And I did a test with a scene from one of the Dresden Files, because this new Dolby Atmos tech came out, which is 3D rendering in audio.
I remember that.
Where you can move objects in 3D. And so I did this test with the Dresden Files, and I was like, wow, this is really cool. I would listen to it. And I'm someone who almost exclusively listens to audiobooks. Like, I don't read physical books because I have trouble not doing something while I'm reading. Every time I listen to an audiobook, unless it's a Star Wars book, I'm thinking, wow, this could be so much more, because the Star Wars books do have some sound effects and stuff. And so, yeah, that kind of cascaded into, okay, my dream would be to talk to a publisher, like the publisher for the Dresden Files or for Lord of the Rings or whatever it is, and get permission to do something like this. And then obviously the realization comes soon after that that's never going to happen, because the publishers are never going to say yes to a gamble like that. And so I was like, well, what if I just sidestep the rights issue and do it without the narration? Because then there's nothing, it's just sounds that are happening, and they happen to coincide exactly with the book.
Right.
That you have either in your hands or an audiobook that you've purchased from Audible or something. So I kind of got off track here, but somewhere in there, Chad Bornholt and I decided to do the Council of Elrond as a test of this concept. And we talked about that before.
We did.
At length. But that was kind of the true Tolkien test of it. In terms of, I finally had the Atmos tech, and I was like, could we make this an experience, was basically the thing. Could it be an experience where, I mean, the Council of Elrond chapter in audio is as long or longer than the extended version of the Fellowship movie. So could you hold people's attention for that long, audio-wise, score-wise? Because it's a lot of music. It's a lot of sound. It's a lot of, having people read or you reading. So it was kind of a test of concept to see really if I could pull off all of the non-narration stuff, if I could pull off the ambience and all this stuff. And it was pretty, like, compared to the full soundscape that I'm working on now, it is like a baby version, but it was enough to be like, okay, I think I could do this for real. And so that's kind of what led to the idea of doing the Kickstarter and doing the soundscape.
I remember, I'm still blown away by that Council of Elrond.
Thank you.
And I am kind of mad that when I originally talked to you and Chad about it, that I have no idea where my recording went. I still have the video on YouTube, but this was back in 2020, May 2020. So 3 years ago.
That's crazy.
You, Chad, and almost the entirety of the Friends of Mr. Underhill Smial got together and made parts for all of the speaking roles, not just the people who were speaking in the Council of Elrond, but also the people who they were mentioning in the Council of Elrond and talking about. Like, right. So that was amazing.
So the fun part about it, and I have to give, at least half of the credit or more to Chad on this, because Chad is the man of hyper detail.
Boy.
And as an understatement. And what was really cool about it was I had done the soundscape episodes for the podcast before, and I had my narrator, Sherston, do the narration part, and then I would have, maybe a couple guests here and there read character roles, and I thought that was cool. And then when I started talking with Chad about it, Council of Elrond is an obvious one to do for that, because you've got 15 people there or so, and a bunch of people that are speaking that aren't there. And then it kind of cascaded into Chad being like, well, Elrond speaks about, because the text says, and then Elrond blah 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 spoke of all this stuff, and Chad was like, wouldn't it be cool if we actually had Elrond say that in the background? And so it cascaded into this more and more and more and more detail that you can toss in there. And I'm almost disappointed because in the actual soundscape version, it's missing a lot of that detail, because it's all the chapters in all 3 books. That's the one that suffers the most with not having actual text in the soundscape. So it doesn't have any of the flashback stuff, any of that kind of stuff, because it's all actually in the text, so I can't use it. But yeah, so that was a big undertaking that cascaded into more and more and more and more detail. But that led to this concept of, if I were to do a full soundscape, how cool it would be to go to that detail on everything. How much could I add to it? And the soundscape is the beginnings of that, because again, if I ever had permission to do it for real with the book, then there would be tons and tons and tons and tons of stuff that would be added through actual lore content that people are speaking. But it was a really cool exercise in detail and in what could be done and how to do it, because it's not something that is really done in this way there's audio dramas and stuff like that, but it's not really done to this hyper detail as if it were a movie. And so I wanted to test myself to see if I could do it, to see if the tech could do it in a way that was satisfying to me and to everyone else. And yeah, it was kind of an explorative kind of thing, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. It was a great exploration. You got the community together to pull off this feat. And I'm recalling everybody was so incredibly impressed when it was presented at the Moot. I mean,
I'd love to remaster it and re-release it, because I've gotten so many better score sounds and things like that. And I could, and the coolest part of it though was that the people were recording like Gandalf's lines on a phone, and that's kind of the beauty of, if people wanted to do this with students or whatnot, like you don't need a fancy setup.
Yeah.
Really, you just need a quiet room, and the phone or the microphone on your phone is good enough to start to get something going. And yeah, sure, if we had a real studio to record all that stuff, it would be better, but it's pretty awesome as is. And yeah, it was literally just, you got your phone, that's enough. Find your closet, record in there, and send me Gandalf's lines, and we'll put it in there. And that's how it kind of came together. And it kept, like I said, it kept cascading into more and more, because I was like, Chad, we need someone for this. And then he would say, oh, this line in the background, and then we'd be like, oh, we need someone for that. And then on and on and on and on and on.
And of course, he had to make sure everyone was pronouncing every single word correctly,
Exactly.
Especially if it was in Elvish. So
exactly.
And right,
those are the rules.
Those are the rules, and you follow the rules.
Exactly.
So when we last talked about this project, I was going over our video again, and I asked you how it helped you and Chad to understand the text better. How would you answer that question now, especially as you've been working on your own soundscape? How do the elements that you introduce help students and or other readers understand the text?
Well, I'll preface this whole thing by saying I'm super lucky to be editing the Prancing Pony as I'm doing this, because even though as I'm editing the Prancing Pony podcast, a lot of the time I'm not hyper focused on the content of what they're saying, because I just can't be. I have to be, but I can't help but to absorb the meat of what they're saying a lot of the time. And so that and Corey and all these other creators, all of their content is kind of like rolling around in the background in my head. And so there's a lot of angles with this. First angle would be score, right? Where when we're talking about when Gandalf is talking to Frodo in chapter 2 and they mention chants, I have a chants theme that happens like 3 times through the whole deal. Really small things, or there's a pity theme that happens. There's a eucatastrophe theme that happens. And what I can do is I can lay out these things to almost lead listeners to something that the PPP made a big deal of, because Tolkien was trying to make a big deal of it, right? So if we think about just themes, I have a Gollum theme and I have a Smeagol theme, and they go back and forth. It depends on how, I was going to say how Gollum feels, but that's not really it. It's more how we should be feeling about the character.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Gandalf is talking about Gollum, a lot of the time it's the Smeagol theme that feels more pitiable versus the Gollum theme. So you can lead listeners into that direction and kind of guide their thinking a little bit, hopefully. Another example is when the elves are first encountered, their harmonies are mysterious and kind of ancient sounding because that's how the hobbits think of them. And everything, this comes from Corey Olsen's Exploring Lord of the Rings, trying to go through the books as if you were in the perspective of the characters so that you're not being like, well, I know all about elves. They're great. It's all good. Frodo has some of that, but we can't really be sure yet. And when we meet Strider, are we supposed to trust him? Like, do they trust him? We do, because we know who that is. But the first time through, we shouldn't, and we probably don't. So I'm trying to emulate things with the music where the elves come in and the music is kind of ancient and mysterious and from the perspective of the hobbits. And then once we start to sit around the fire, it gets warmer and they're comfortable a little bit more. And so there's things like that that can kind of guide your emotions, which is all Howard Shore did throughout the movies, is to just guide your emotions more than I've seen in any other movie. So that's the score angle. There's a lot of stuff that you can do with that. And that can be from a straight up thematic point of view, like I was just saying, or it can just be from, tension and release in terms of like a scene like Shelob where there's uncomfortable score sounds that are happening that aren't thematic, but they're, meant to add to the tension. So that's the score angle. But from a sound effect point of view, there's a lot that you can do as well where it's, a good example, like tying it back to what I said before, what does a Mumakil sound like? It sounds like an elephant.
Yeah.
Right?
But a very, very big elephant.
Exactly. But it doesn't sound like whatever they used in the movies. And so now I get to redo the sound design for the movie from the movies, but in a more realistic way. Because a lot of what Tolkien was doing was trying to be realistic. And, it's not magic. There's not crazy magic shows happening the whole time. So there shouldn't be like sound design to match fantasy type sound design. So it's interesting to try and avoid those. So that's the fantasy element of the sound design, is like trying to make it as realistic as we can, because that's what Tolkien did. But then there's just the straight up stuff that this is how it would sound. And so I'm trying to get it as close as possible. So a good example with that is I had the privilege of having a Zoom call with Brett Devereaux, the military historian, huge fan of the Tolkien books. And we talked for a while about what would the armor sound like, because they don't have plate mail, right? So it would mostly be chainmail. So that normal like armor marching sound that you hear throughout the whole movies would like not be a thing. It just like they wouldn't have the tech for it really. So like when I get to Helm's Deep, most of it's going to be chainmail, not that clinking armor sound. Or another one that we talked about was how loud would Grond be? Mm-hmm. How loud would, like when we're with Pippin and Gandalf and Denethor, would you hear the battle up there? How loud would it be? How loud's the wind? I've had lots of conversations with Chad about how the height affects the volume of the wind. Things like that, because it's things that Tolkien would have thought about. If we're in Minas Tirith and we're up in the higher levels, it should be howling wind. It should be really windy up there. And comparing it to what's the difference between Fangorn and when we're in the Shire still, ambient wise, what does the forest sound like? Or where are things different? Where are they not different? So there's a lot that you can do with sound design, But it's been interesting to analyze every little step of the way. When the hobbits are saved at the end of book 1, you should hear the bells ringing on the horse, things like that. But would you hear them over the water? Like all this kind of stuff to think about. And the project is cool because I have the kind of ability of going back and refining things progressively. So the people that have purchased it and are listening and things like that, I'm releasing kind of patch notes every month.
Mm-hmm.
So, just the other day, someone pointed out something. And so I can go back and fix that file and re-upload it to get it closer and closer and closer to being accurate. So none of these things that are released are like a half-done version, but there are better, more true versions that I can record later. So, something like that I can just slot in later and re-release it, and everybody gets the newer version. So it's really cool to do stuff like that and kind of refine it as we go. And these conversations will keep coming up, like the weather is a big one,
Oh, I'll bet.
like what is the sound when they're up the mountain and the wind is howling and what do the battles sound like? Probably pretty horrible is what they sound like. And I mean, I haven't gotten to the big battles yet in book 5. I will be having to do some tests, I think, with sending those to people for like initial listening tests, because it should be pretty horrendous to listen to.
Oh, God.
And then you get into the kind of final part of this, which is the balance of the two of them, sound effects versus score. And it's been really interesting and a really cool way to analyze the text, to see how naturally Tolkien will have action and then a moment to relax, or how phrases of the book happen where it really just lends itself naturally to like me deciding where score happens, where it doesn't. Things like that was really natural and one of the easiest parts, because Tolkien really writes it in a way where it feels like, okay, now we should have a relaxing moment. And one of the best examples is in the first chapter, where we have this really tense moment with Bilbo, and then he steps outside and it all calms down. And in that moment, it's just the ambience in the soundscape. I don't know, it's what you would expect, I think. It's a lot of the moments like that are easy to assume because of how Tolkien wrote it. So that's been really interesting. It's just analyzing the text in terms of its phrases and trying to emulate those phrases in the way that we spend forever in the Shire, like forever. And then we finally leave it. And it's so nice. Like when you go back and you reread the chapter where they get back to Bree, and it's raining, and it's just, they haven't discovered what's gone wrong necessarily yet. So they're kind of just at a moment of rest there. And what I'm really excited about is that I've got 4 or 5 chapters worth of like heavy Shire music. Like there's lots of it, and it's repetitive, and it anchors us. Eventually, when we get back to that chapter, I can start to reintroduce some of it, and I think it'll feel really, really awesome when we get there. Just the same way that Tolkien's writing leads us to that, And so I would love to hear what someone's experience is reading the books or listening to the audiobook with the soundscape on their first time. Like they've never experienced it before. That would be really interesting to see.
Listeners, volunteer yourselves.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll set you up with a synced version with Andy Serkis's audiobook.
Yes, exactly. So if you have not read Tolkien before, if you have not heard the audiobook before, if you have not heard the Jordan Soundscape before, now's your chance.
You can be the focus group.
Yay. Oh, that would be
so cool.
brilliant. So let's assume for a moment there's a teacher out there teaching K to 12, college, whatever it might be, that wants to introduce soundscapes or even assign a project.
Mhm.
So what do you think that teacher would need to pull that off? And what advice would you give them?
I think that in terms of tools that you need, like I mentioned before, you really just need a phone that has a mic on it, which is every phone. And then there's two pieces of free software that you can use. One of them is called Audacity, and the other is called Reaper. And they're both free. They're pretty straightforward to use or to figure out if you want to. And what would be like what I would suggest is, if it would be such a cool project to just choose a scene from, or get your student to choose a scene from their favorite book, like not a chapter, but just a scene, and try and recreate it. Try and, even just going through, like, even if you didn't have access to the recording stuff, going through the motions of what would it sound like? What would the weather sound like? What kind of, ambient sounds? What kind of weapon sounds, or any of that kind of stuff? Making a list. I mean, that was a huge part of my soundscape, is I have spreadsheets upon spreadsheets of detail listed. This chapter, and then how many people are present in the chapter, which means you would need this many voice actors, or what's in the background, what would you hear, all that kind of detail. You can list it all out. It would be such a fun group project to do, really, because then you could start assigning things, right? Like, okay, this person does all the ambience, person does all the voices, and just collects all the information. And then from there, you can start, again, as a group. It would be cool to get creative and be like, okay, we've got to record a forest. Where would we do that? Where's one nearby? Who could do that? We got to have footsteps here. How are we going to do that? Everything becomes a creative problem to solve, because especially if you don't have the tech, you have to come up with natural ways of attaining all of these things. And you start to, you get things where, if you take a piece of canvas and you run a pencil across it and you mic it up really close, you can get like the sound of wind from it, or something that passes as the sound of wind, and you start to be like, okay, well, if I can't do it for real, then we got to come up with some other way. And that's the gist of it. You have to come up with some way to do it. So what's it going to be? Is it going to be someone like, blowing air across their microphone to get the sound? It's a kind of perfect group project, really, to challenge problem solving, and see what you can come up with. But yeah, really all you need is, like, if the teacher had Audacity or Reaper and all the kids had their phones or something to record with, then you could just get everybody to go do their task after the research is done, and then you can start to place it in there. And if it's just a project, I mean, you could narrate the book too and have everyone have different voice roles and stuff like that, and I think it'd be awesome.
So awesome. It's exactly what I was thinking when I first heard your Council of Elrond. Like, I got to get a teacher out there to do this.
It'd be so cool.
So cool. Oh,
I should do like a class on it online, just for fun, just like with random books, like just whatever random thing. And it wouldn't have to be like some official soundscape, but it would be like just a team of people all put together, and we go through the research and just explore it and get everyone to be like, okay, so this week you get some footsteps, this week you do this, and we put it all together. That'd be really cool.
I could just hear Sean Marchese in the corner yelling, "Pick Dune, pick Dune."
That's a conversation for down the road, for future soundscapes.
Brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your opinion, what is the value of fantasy? So why even bring it into the classroom in our current world, and perhaps even in your technical classes? Most people see college or vocational schools as a place to get a degree, learn the skills they need for employment to get a job. So what would you say to people who might ask, how is watching a fantasy movie, reading a fairy tale, how is that going to get me a job?
interesting question, and not an easy one to answer. Well, first of all, for me personally, getting a job is not the end goal of life, and
Yeah.
so that's just like it's a realistic question, but it's not a question that matters to me, and so I understand its value, but it's not personally what I am aiming towards. But let's see, if I were asked that question, I think that in our own worlds, we only experience so much. And fantasy is the opportunity to experience endless stuff. And, George R. R. Martin has that quote about the reader. The person who doesn't read only lives one life, and the person who reads lives 1,000 lives, kind of thing. And I just think that seeing it as, just something that's made up is totally missing the point of what it is. It doesn't matter if it's real or not. There's lessons to be learned. There's emotion to be experienced. And there's excitement. And I think excitement is the key to it for most of the time in the classroom, where, like I said earlier, like what got me excited to do sound design and to explore all this stuff was loving Star Wars. And Star Wars is, more than anything, the catalyst to a lot of things in people's lives. I find if someone loves Star Wars, then they have done something in their life because of Star Wars that's not Star Wars related, I think that it has that power, and a lot of the time I think that it's because Star Wars is just a fun time. It's just fun to be there. It's fun to enjoy that world. And you have that with things like Dune or Lord of the Rings as well, but I don't think to the same extent, because I love being in the world of Lord of the Rings, obviously, but it's not a fun time the whole time, right?
Yeah.
And Star Wars, even at its most tragic, is still a pretty good time to just be there because it's cool. Things are cool and it's fun, and it's, not always lighthearted, but most of the time it is. And it's just nice to be there. And I think that sometimes we need to not be here and we need to be there instead. And when we're over there, we start to see things that could lead us to things. And the good example is, ever since first Star Wars came out, everyone was trying to make their own lightsaber. And you get, YouTube channels who are these, serious high-level engineers that are using the love of Star Wars and the people that follow their channels' love for Star Wars to help them, get as close as they can to actually doing that for real, with like real, like I said, high-level engineering skills. And so when you see something like Dune or Star Wars in particular, it's like, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we could do that? And then it, I've always thought it's almost inevitable, especially with Disney being the catalyst for endless Star Wars now. Like inevitably, when we get to the point where we have flying cars or whatever it might be, you better bet that some of them are going to look like they're from Star Wars. And so it's going to be really interesting in 100 years or so. Will our world look like that because of how much it means to people? And will it almost be like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where it's like the things that we saw in Star Wars and that we love so much, wouldn't it be cool to bring those to life? And so we do everything we can to do that because we think it's so cool. And then that's kind of what guides us into our our future tech, like holograms and stuff like that. You bet they're gonna end up, because whenever anyone is trying to design something like that, you can't help, even if you don't know what Star Wars is because you haven't seen it, I'm sure that idea will come up at some point, and it'll guide you towards, having a hologram that kind of looks like that, you know? And the real tech will probably aim and come out differently, but I think it's kind of inevitable for the fantasy to drive, because Star Wars is fantasy, so it's going to drive creation. And I think that the beauty of it is really, like, if you ever watch Light and Magic, documentary on Disney Plus about Industrial Light and Magic, the company that brought Star Wars to life with George Lucas. That documentary is fascinating because every step of the way, George Lucas is like 10 years ahead of everyone else with his ideas and what he wants to do. And to the point where he walks into the tech that they use to film The Mandalorian, these like projection screens or whatever. And he's like, yeah, this is what I was trying to do during the prequel stuff. And that was like 20 years ago. And he was unfazed by it because he was like, this is what I meant. And nobody believed me and nobody thought we could do it because they couldn't do it back then. But he was so far in the future with it. And I think that that's why George is such a genius, because everything that he was doing was looking so far ahead, and, you know, in terms of the tech, but also in terms of when he first released the movie, part of the agreement was that he would retain the rights to the toys and the merch.
Yes.
Which gave him the money to make all the rest of them. And that kind of foresight, because he knew that it was for kids and that it's always been for kids, is like what's created Star Wars today. And I think it's interesting because the bottom line of all Star Wars is that it should be a good time, that it should be hopeful. That's why people grow up and they still love it, and then they try to bring to life these things that they love, you know? And I think that that is the value of it. I think that creating passion in someone through something that they wish was real is kind of like the key to the future, you could say.
Because those kids, they grow up.
Yep.
The kids grow up and become adults.
And it's all like the stories they hear are the basis of all of it, right? And that was obviously true with Tolkien, and it was true with Christopher Tolkien, and it continues on, right? And I think that right now we're in an interesting world where some things are built to continue. Star Wars will never end because it doesn't have to, because there's always new stories. George Lucas created a world that other people can play in. Star Wars is open for anyone to do anything. And that's why I love Star Wars, and I love like Marvel comics or DC comics to the level that I do, because it's endless. And you can always, you know, Peter Parker's been in his 20s for 60 or more years, you know? So
Peter Parker's in a nursing home by now. Let's be honest.
Perpetual storytelling is just, it's nice, because what's cool about it is, and this is why Lord of the Rings maybe should stay where it is because you can always come back to the same character, the same way they were when you left them 20 years ago or something like that. And the kind of beauty with it is that in Star Wars or in Marvel, new stories happen, but the character is still the one that you knew most of the time, right?
Right.
So yeah, I think that the passion that it drives is the purpose, or the most useful aspect of it. That was a long-winded answer.
But a brilliant answer, I think.
Hopefully it was decent.
A+. A+. Speaking of A+, if you could choose any character in fantasy pop culture to be your teacher, who would you choose and why?
This was a hard one to think about, but I think I would land on Qui-Gon Jinn from Star Wars Episode 1 for sure. And the reason for that is that his whole teaching is always just to be present. And I follow a lot of, or try to think about a lot of Taoist stuff, and that's what Qui-Gon teaches.
Yeah.
So I'm down. That would be my choice. My follow-up would be Ahsoka.
Even though she technically dropped out?
She became a true Jedi.
Yeah. Okay.
She's
Good
like
answer.
the person that sees the real purpose of school, of the real purpose of learning, and drops out of school
Mm-hmm.
to learn properly in her own way.
I could definitely agree with that. She sees the fault in the institution.
Exactly.
Yes. There it is.
Exactly.
So, do you have any upcoming projects or publications that you'd like to share with our listeners? You've got the Soundscape going. Do you have any others that you'd like to share?
Well, right now the focus is the Soundscape. So, Fellowship is released. Two Towers is releasing on the 20th of May, if all goes well. Fingers crossed. And then Return of the King, hopefully will be out before September. We'll see. September is like the final delivery for that. Other than that, there are plans already for follow-up Soundscape Kickstarters to happen. The Hobbit is going to be next. Potentially alone, potentially not alone. We'll see. But that'll happen December 1st. I'm going to launch the Kickstarter for that. But yeah, otherwise, my focus is on Soundscapes and continuing forward with them and trying to think of what's next after Middle-earth. I know what I want to do next, but I don't know if that's what the listeners will want me to do next. So we'll see. I also had a really exciting conversation. It's just really exciting to talk about the possibilities of these. So, I mean, the one that makes the most sense to do next is definitely Harry Potter. But we'll see. I'm not sure about that one yet. But I would love to do it because the possibilities in that it would be so much fun. It would just be so much fun to do those. And then my dream eventually would be to do A Song of Ice and Fire, but that would be like a 5-year project at least. So.
Yeah. Well, you have time to do that one because George isn't even finished yet. So
he'll get there one of these days.
One of these days he'll get there, but it gives you time to play around at least.
Exactly. Yeah.
He's not even giving you a deadline.
Not even giving himself a deadline.
That too. Yeah. Just that.
Yeah.
Well, Jordan, thank you so much for chatting with me today. It's been wonderful to talk to you. Listeners, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. If you'd like to participate in the Lord of the Rings Soundscape project and see Jordan's future projects, be sure to check out the show notes for the relevant links. Jordan's provided everything you need. And be sure to stick around for our next episode. We've got plenty more people to talk to and plenty more characters to discuss. Listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your other favorite podcast feeds. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a rating and a review as well. You can read and find out more about Teaching with Magic by visiting our website, teachingwithmagic.blog. You can leave a message on our podcast page, read past Teaching with Magic posts, and check out our book lists on our affiliate page. We also invite you to support us on Patreon. You'll have access to bonus material, our Discord channel, live Q&As, and you'll get a sneak peek at future products such as lesson plans, worksheets, and other teaching tools. The link is always available in our show notes and the podcast page on our website. Thanks again for joining us, and as always, keep making magic.